Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss Donald Trump's victory in the presidential election and Kamala Harris's loss. I'm joined by Sohrab Ahmari and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So we're recording this on Thursday morning. It's a bit more than a day since we learned that Donald Trump will once again be president of the United States. I stayed up late to watch him give his victory speech. Uh, Reminded me of 8 years ago when I did the same. And as he came out on the stage at about 2:30 in the morning to the kind of sentimental lyrics of Lee Greenwood's "God Bless the USA," I have to say that I was astounded once again. This is a man who shocked the world by being elected in 2016, led a very chaotic administration, uh, chaos that culminated in January 6th and the violence of that day. A man who's been charged uh, time after time, 4 separate criminal cases, convicted of a felony, uh, shot, uh, another assassination attempt. He was left for dead after the GOP's loss in 2022. Many of the pundits who were celebrating his victory this week said he should be impeached multiple times and that his political career should be over, in terms of pundits on the right. And it's just an astounding political resurrection. And I think it's hard to absorb that because Donald Trump is such a familiar figure. And whether you're inclined to dislike him or you take a more mixed view, it's really hard to be surprised by him at this point. But I have to say, it even though my reaction wasn't as visceral as it was 8 years ago, I just sat there thinking, how did he do this? How is this possible? Uh, and that's my question for you, Sarab. How did Trump do it?
He did it by having a very clear set of issues: immigration and the economy, by speaking directly and pretty in a very disciplined way to those issues. It was actually a pretty issues driven campaign. It's not to say that they didn't get in their own way the last week. They did. This is the Trump campaign. It's going to be boisterous. It is open to lots of weird elements, but at the end of the day, voters took the totality of circumstances, of their own material circumstances, and the kind of decay that they witnessed all around them with the shape of blue governance, what it's like to live in blue governed cities and states, the massive invasion of illegal migrants over the first 2-3 years of the Biden administration, curbed somewhat, but too little, too late toward the end of the administration. And the fact that despite some important reforms, which we at Compact have championed, either under our own bylines, the three of us here, or by other contributors, that in some areas of the economy, whether it's the Federal Trade Commission under Lena Khan or their industrial policies, the CHIPS Act, overall, the reforms weren't sufficient to make people feel less precarious and less frustrated economically. So it's just pretty simple. I mean, I think it's easier to say, and I know we'll get to it, so I won't spoil it, as it were. It's easier to say what Kamala Harris and the Democrats did wrong, But we have to give credit where due. I mean, just a campaign that was focused on laser focused economy, immigration, most important issues on the minds of voters. Address that.
Right, and I think one thing I wanna get at here is, I mean, this is Donald Trump. He is, uh, you know, a man, previously known as the star of The Apprentice, his cameo on Home Alone 2, this kind of absurd New York tabloid figure. He has crushed the Republican Party as it once existed. It's over. David Frum, the uh, very skilled and for a long time very influential neoconservative writer, announced that he has left the party. I think that's definitely a sign of how the party has changed. How did he? I mean, why this man rather than some of the smart, sensible, accomplished people you have on the right? Uh, yeah, I mean,
Can
how?
I can
Why?
I
Why
get in on
him?
this? This is something that Matthew and I have written about for about 2 years now, starting with our famous, infamous essay, "He's Still the One," in which we endorsed Trump at the time for the Republican primary, for the 2024 Republican primary. And since then, we've developed it, and especially Matthew, in basically actually just it's become a series of op-eds for the New York Times and elsewhere, in which he's argued that actually what Trump has done is pull the Republican Party, which under the Bush, Romney, Paul Ryan dispensation was becoming a very marginal, in a way, was on the path to becoming a marginal regional rump party. What did it offer you under that dispensation? Endless wars in the Middle East, fruitless, endless wars in the Middle East. We're going to cut your entitlements and some kind of like moral evangelical hectoring. He took that party, which again was on the way to becoming moribund and irrelevant, and pulled it to the center on policy issues. I'm not going to cut your entitlements. I'm not going to listen to Paul Ryan on Social Security. The post 9/11 wars have been a disaster, um, and the kind of neoliberal globalization characterized by free trade and free movement of labor has devastated working class communities, and basically pulled it to the center. The paradox of Trump, and it's not something I can answer here. It's probably something we would explore in books to come, is that the person who is able to remake this political party into something that is more centrist and more moderate on policy issues was someone who is quote unquote extreme, in the sense that he's out of the norm of what you expect from a normal, quote unquote, normal politician. And that's the paradox. I've argued in a cover essay for the New Statesman that partly it's the duopoly, that the fact that we have an iron duopoly of two major parties in this country actually allows popular sentiment to be expressed at the ballot box and then in a governing agenda. What do I mean by that? In Europe, they have very similar kind of political parties, especially Western and Northern Europe. Reform UK, AFD in Germany, the National Rally, or what used to be called the National Front in France, and so on and so forth. And these parties consistently get pluralities at the ballot box, but they never get to translate their agenda into a governing agenda. Why? Because the other so-called mainstream parties, even if they might be fairly small, the sort of center left, center right neoliberals, what our friend Christopher Caldwell calls the bourgeois parties, can bandwagon together, and basically create kind of cordon sanitaire around populist parties. And so they never get to govern, even if they win large pluralities at the ballot box. We have two parties. It's seen as rigid, right? You either get, vanilla or chocolate. You get Democrat or Republican. We don't have anything. It's like McSorley's, the legendary, the oldest bar, continuous bar in Manhattan. You get dark beer or light beer. That's it. And maybe they also give you like onions and cheese. That's the only other options. That's your green party, I guess. But the point is, because you have this party, the two parties that have to be flexible, and they're open to being realigned, to being taken over, so that if there is a popular will out there, it will get translated into the agenda of one of the two parties eventually. So I think that's one of the reasons why Trump was able to do it. Is actually it's a gift of our party duopoly, which a lot of like kind of political scientist types are like, oh, but this is undemocratic. You can't have like these boutique parties. There's other things. Well, whatever. You get two parties, and if you have a popular enough agenda, you can take one of them over and then win the country at large.
So, Geoff, I am going to lean on you more heavily for why Harris lost, but I do want to get you in on why Trump won.
Yeah, so in terms of this comeback, one thing that I thought of, in processing the kind of surprise of the moment Matthew evoked earlier was I lived in Providence, Rhode Island, where there was a mayor who infamously was criminally indicted, put in jail, and then came back and won re-election. Now, this also happened so that was Buddy Cianci in Providence. This also happened a little bit earlier with Marion Barry in Washington, D.C. So these are, if we wanted to look for figures who had these kinds of, the specific kinds of comebacks where, they were essentially comebacks from jail, or in Trump's case, from a series of criminal indictments. You could go to the realm of kind of urban machine politics, and it is notable that Trump is he wasn't a politician; he was a developer, a businessman, but in a sense, he was a creature of sort of urban machine politics as it existed in New York City as he was coming up in the world. And has that, as has been often discussed, has that kind of transactional sensibility we associate with that kind of politics. But the thing that does strike me about figures like Barry and Cianci, and I'll just share an anecdote, which is when I was in Providence, I once overheard. I think it was around the time Buddy Cianci had died, maybe. And notably he was I believe indicted and imprisoned, then came back, was reelected, then once again was indicted and imprisoned, and I think had at least some chance of being able to become mayor again, but then ended up dying before he could do that. But getting sick and dying before he could do that. I believe that's more or less the chronology. So I overheard this couple discussing Cianci on the bus. I won't try to imitate the Rhode Island accents, although they are important to the story. But the wife was saying, the wife just remarked something about Buddy being a crook, and the husband said, he wasn't a crook, he's a good guy. And the wife said, oh, you just liked him because he beat up his wife's boyfriend. Now, this refers to one of his various criminal escapades, which involved getting state troopers to guard the door of the mayor's mansion while he, literally beat up his wife's boyfriend or suspected boyfriend. So the point here would be that, and this I think speaks to both, one of Matthew's pieces on Trump in the New York Times about Trump and the archetype of the outlaw, and also Christian Parenti's piece for us in Compact on why the series of indictments and the whole campaign of lawfare did not seem to weaken Trump's appeal.
Yeah, Donald Trump, defendant in chief, is the Parenti piece in Compact.
Yes, and I would note, I believe there was a Washington Post headline that referred to Trump as the first felon to be elected. So, one of these kind of nice firsts in American history. We didn't get the first woman president, but we do get the first felon. So, the point I'd make here is that I think one reason he won is that, as both Matthew and Christian have written, and again, we see this in the case of these kind of populist urban machine politicians previously. There are a lot of people who may simply identify not with the system that is prosecuting the candidate, but rather with the candidate as a victim of the system, as somebody who's beleaguered and feels persecuted by an establishment that itself seems corrupt and unjust. And so I think we see this phenomenon maybe for the first time on a massive scale. And I think in terms of the seeming rising support for Trump among lower income people, as well as a wide array of minority voters, Black and Latino, particularly Black male and Latino voters, which are, as has been of course discussed, endlessly more likely to have experiences with the criminal justice system, negative experiences with the criminal justice system. It does seem that once again you have this idea that there's a sense of, and that going back to the CNC anecdote, it's like that is sort of the outlaw archetype, right? It's like, well, but he did what he may not have done what was legal, but he was standing up for a kind of principle, and so he could be seen as embodying some kind of higher law, even if much of what he did might seem to most of us quite disreputable. And so I think that that would be another key here, that really the lawfare, the series of attempts to prosecute Trump does seem to have demonstrably backfired and actually contributed to his image, to his populist image, in the way that we saw previously with these urban populist mayors.
Yeah, I think it's worth connecting the two assessments you've given, Sohrab and Geoff, which I think are complementary. Trump is a figure that has opposed the consensus on certain points like immigration and trade. He long before he, or at least years before he ran for office, had articulated dissenting views on these topics. That distinguishes him from Kamala Harris, who really has had no fixed views, or at least fixed views that distinguish her from the party apparatus. Um, and then he also, in addition to opposing the consensus, just seemed to have this incredible ability and just profound desire to be personally oppositional toward the establishment. He would pick fights with it and obviously crave the approval of the media and of businessmen. It's clear that at some level he wants Maggie Haberman to like him. He wants Jamie Dimon to praise him, but he also insists on saying things that upset these people. Sean Hannity gave him an absolute softball question earlier this year, saying, "A lot of people say you'll be a dictator. What do you say to that?" And Trump says, "Oh, no, no, no. I won't be, except on the first day, just the first day." And there are two readings of that. One is that Trump is promising a true dictatorial regime, and there are a lot of very well positioned journalists who have that view. I I think that's less plausible than just saying that Trump has this impishness, which can be subversive and lead in some uh, very unwelcome directions, but is not the same as wanting to be a dictator or an authoritarian. It's instead a desire to really tweak people and not to show docility. And so it's that uh, something about him, his just desire to pick fights with this establishment that so many Americans, as Jeff says, so many Americans view as corrupt. I mean, Chris Caldwell wrote this for us in his piece, at compactmag.com, Why Trump Won. If America, a majority of Americans, elects a convicted felon, they're saying that this process that led to his conviction isn't something that deserves respect or deference. It is a rejection of our system and a statement that it is corrupt. And Trump has really effectively channeled that. There was a good report in the New York Times this week by the journalist Sean McCreesh, a correspondent who's followed Trump on the campaign trail and written some insightful articles, including a profile of J.D. Vance's mother. And in that piece, uh, McCreesh talks about the assassination attempt, the first one, the one that actually drew Trump's blood, uh, as a moment that really solidified Trump's image as, in Mark Zuckerberg's words, a bad ass, um, or as a kind of outlaw hero, a John Gotti type, as McCreesh says, someone who's able to survive, quote, legal and mortal peril, unquote, as he opposes this corrupt system. So it's just it's a remarkable moment. I mean, it's a much bigger win than 2016, which was much narrower, and it has these mythological elements as well as real policy elements and uh, an ability to hammer the issues as Sohrab outlined. Obviously, there's the other side of this. Kamala Harris, uh, she didn't win. Uh, Geoff, why? I mean, there are a lot of explanations on offer. What are some of those, and what do you think is the most persuasive one?
Well, I want to give a sort of long view answer and a short view answer. Right? And by short, I don't mean that short. I mean, kind of the arc of the Obama Democratic Party that emerged post 2008. By long, I mean roughly the past 50 years. So the long view, I would point people back to my review of Tim Schenk's book, Left Adrift, which appeared compactmag.com, The Long De-Alignment. And it's a book that I've been recommending very widely since I was recommending it before, but I'm basically telling everybody to read it. It's a nice, concise 200 pages, but I think it's incredibly insightful for understanding this election and the ways that it resembles many of the elections that have occurred roughly since the late 1960s, early 1970s. And so the long view answer here is simply that the Democrats once existed as the sort of dominant party on the strength of the New Deal coalition, which we've covered heavily. They were embedded in all kinds of mediating institutions in civil society, as well as organized labor, and achieved much of what they did through having this incredibly broad-based kind of system of representation that sort of channeled the interests of working class people into a policy agenda. And then for various reasons, as occurred across much of the Western world, gradually this kind of order collapsed, and what that left you with was a party that still was connected to organized labor and continues to be connected to organized labor, although there's been more kind of competitiveness on that front, as we've covered extensively. But organized labor is itself far weaker; it's far more hollowed out. This is this notion of the void that essentially what used to be the means through which democratic participation in the process of politics on an everyday level, right, through these various kinds of organizations, kind of died out and withered, and you had this kind of atomization of politics, and kind of the collapse of these kind of mediating entities. And so what you end up with is a kind of retail politics as a kind of consumption that these sort of political consultants come in and try to brand politicians to varying success in order to capture just enough of the vote, right? And so what you end up with, except for brief periods like the sort of Reagan era, is a series of very close elections. That's what we've seen really since the 1990s, with the 2008 Obama election really being the exception. And so in that sense, I think, Harris losing just speaks to a broader situation we've seen over and over again, which is that, she wasn't in the scheme of, and, perhaps this has to do also with the nature of the duopoly, as Sohrab described it, but, in the scheme of the current kind of backlash against incumbents, she didn't really do that badly. She was within, probably in the popular vote, which it's shocking that she lost, but nonetheless, she was still within probably 1.5 or 2 percentage points. And that's also true in most of the key battleground states. And so, she basically, despite her weaknesses, which I'll get into in a second, did relatively well And this election looked like a lot of the other ones, which are decided within a few percentage points. If we go back to 2000, if we go back to 2016, these are pretty common situations. And so it really speaks to a party that was in its modern form was built around these kind of mass organizations that were able to mobilize working class people that have largely withered and died away, or simply been weakened into a rump of themselves. And so that means there's been this reliance on retail politics, which has tended to involve increasingly mobilizing sort of affluent professionals on the grounds of identity, of sort of, what are thought of as sort of culture war issues, cultural progressivism. And, we saw, I think actually Harris trying to dial that kind of appeal back somewhat this time around, and instead offering in the retail politics this kind of generic invocation of the middle class, and this sort of it attempted to look like a kind of economic populism, but it was incredibly vague. It was just these kind of invocations of the middle class, and promises of relatively small and minor seeming reforms, tax credits and first-time home buyer credits and things like this. So it really did not amount to a kind of sweeping set of claims or anything, compared to Trump in particular, particularly precise or memorable in terms of policy. It seemed like a kind of vague simulacrum of some kind of attempt at like a broad-based set of economic appeals, but it never actually seemed to cash out into anything particular. So that's like the weakness of the campaign. And, many have observed this. And then the final thing I'll say is more to do with process. And I think that's the kind of shorter view, although, again, it really has to do with what the Democratic Party has been since 2008. So, as I was saying, I think, the party in its modern form was built up around things like labor unions, which, provide kind of channeled mass politics into means of representation. And, this is true of urban machine politics in its traditional forms too, right? These kinds of clubs and kind of social organizations that were connected to the party apparatus, but also, operated at a local level and allowed for some kind of democratic input into the whole system and some kind of sense of stake in it. So in terms of process, again, all of that has sort of been in decay a long time ago. Think about sort of Robert Putnam and various sociologists who have documented that. But, one thing that did exist was still party primaries as a means of allowing average people to have some sort of input into the shaping of the policy of the party that was supposed to represent them. So something that's notable about this year, as well as basically all of the cycles since 2008, is that the Democratic Party not only can no longer kind of count on these mass organizations to give it some kind of sense of small d democratic legitimacy and connection to the people. Since the primary in which Obama prevailed in 2008, it has instead attempted to operate on the basis of a series of coronations, right? A kind of completely openly sort of anti-democratic procedure, right? So in 2016, essentially you have the attempted crowning of Hillary Clinton, and then Bernie Sanders shows up as a sort of spoiler of that process, and is treated as kind of is treated as this kind of incredibly sort of harmful and disruptive figure who is and whatever kind of opposition to the party establishment's choice that is kind of expressing itself through the surprising traction he gets is treated as as toxic, as male entitlement is sort of dismissed and demeaned in all kinds of ways by the party. And so so you get this coronation process, and then you have a series of kind of procedural maneuvers that squeeze out Sanders. I'm not sure that he had a chance of winning, but there was a sense, certainly among his supporters, and full disclosure, I was one of them and interacted with a lot of them at the time and did like campaign for him and stuff, that he was not treated fair. He was not treated as a fair contender, but as a spoiler who kind of had to be pushed aside. And so that, I think, again, spoke to this kind of anti-democratic small d sensibility. Then the same thing essentially happens in 2020 when you have the beginning of a primary process, which is then cut short through, again, a kind of top-down coronation process. And you have a kind of repetition of Sanders functioning as the spoiler, but essentially him and his supporters being enjoined to get on board because, we were in a crisis. Trump was a crisis. COVID was a crisis. And so we couldn't afford the luxuries of the democratic, process of deciding this. And so there was this kind of behind the scenes orchestration of who the candidate was going to be, right? And then once again, we had the same thing this year, right? We had a coronation of a figure who had, notably failed in the primary process in 2020, had been sort of selected for obscure sort of intersectional coalitional reasons. And, I will say, I think Harris, is very, very flawed and kind of, not particularly adept or impressive just as a kind of retail politician. That said, she probably did, roughly as well as she could have. And again, in a way, what's surprising is that she wasn't defeated more resoundingly, which I think speaks partly to Trump's own problems, but also to, maybe the kind of residual strength of party identification. But
you don't see a Gretchen Whitmer or a Josh Shapiro doing much better than Harris.
No. Well, what I do see is, I think that's a good question. Sorry, initially I thought you meant for the VP pick, as far as, Walz versus Shapiro, but
right.
which I don't think would have mattered at all.
Right. And sorry to jump at, instead, at that moment when it was clear that Biden wasn't up to a second term, let alone maybe the end of his first, if the Democratic Party had done a kind of, quick and dirty kind of quasi primary or something.
I mean, I think that would have been very, if it had been sort of after the disastrous debate in June, there's not really any practical way that would have happened. So the problem was really instead that Biden, despite his own assurances back in 2020, decided to stay on, that there was this kind of, and again, this speaks also to the anti-democratic spirit of the party elites, is that, there was this code of silence about, discussing his clear senility and problems with continuing to do the job. There was this, stigmatization of anybody who raised this uncomfortable stuff. I mean, this is a very weird, and again, just anti-democratic seeming party, because it really, it tried to force people to, not see what was right in front of them, which is very bizarre. And then, it just felt like there was a huge amount of sort of gaslighting and just kind of open deception. And it just, so I think if you imagine maybe a primary process, which again, the party seems just radically averse to having at all since 2008, if you can imagine maybe a primary process going back to 2019, where there is a genuine kind of contestation about what the future of the party should be, again, maybe that somewhat allays these problems, although you're still facing the headwinds against incumbency in the current kind of post-COVID inflationary climate. So it's not clear to me that would have worked, but I think it would have at least been better than what we ended up with, which is this just kind of this party that again and again seems just radically hostile to just basic democratic deliberation. And, comparing it to the Trump situation, regardless of what you think of him, he did, despite massive opposition from the party establishment back in 2016, and then again coming out of the 2022 midterms, he did face off a huge amount of opposition from the party apparatus, and on the strength of building, a base of popular support. And so there was at least a feeling that the party and its standard bearer had been both the party platform and its standard bearer had been shaped through the participation of the electorate, as opposed to this kind of weird situation on the Democratic side, which just seems very demoralizing and disillusioning if you're just going to repeatedly kind of pick people and tell people they have to get in line and shut up and not say anything about it. I just don't see how that's a sustainable thing. So I guess my overarching thing is this speaks to the evolution of the party over the past 50 years and over the past sort of 15 or so years. And I think that for it to have a future, it really has to change course, at least by opening itself up to more serious democratic small d deliberation in the way that, the piece we published after the election by Zed Jalani, makes a similar argument to this. So I think that's probably the only way forward that will, allow it to change course.
Now, Geoff, you mentioned Harris's selection by Biden as VP and how that turned out to be a really, really significant choice. Not because it necessarily uh, helped or hurt Biden, especially in the 2020 race, but it did a couple things. One, it told us something about the nature of the party and its self understanding and about how decisions are being made. And then it became very consequential once Biden left or announced he would not be running for reelection. And so I do want to just take a moment to talk a bit about the two VP selections and their significance. Again, not so much in electoral terms as if one really profoundly helped or hurt his side, but just in terms of what they say about the party. And Sohrab, I just want to kind of get your thoughts on what we've seen from Vance since his selection in the summer. You know Vance, you have interviewed Vance. It was I would say a pretty widely panned pick when it was made.
Yeah, in part, even from just intra GOP logic, what you're supposed to do, quote unquote, is you pick someone who introduces a sort of regional variation or ideological. This kind of the idea is that you bring in balance. That's what the traditional idea, what the V pick does for you. And in Vance's case, the initial resistance or initial skepticism, even on the right, was that, well, Trump already has the working class base, and Vance brings more of the working class base. So is that is that the right choice to make? And I think it just was answered. I don't know what can I tell you. I mean, just that skepticism was debunked by the result. I would say actually the skepticism was put to rest by the debate performance. Up until the debate performance, you could be like, oh, okay, whatever. I know Vance. Matthew knows Vance. Impressive guy, a thinker, etc. Then he did that utterly devastating debate. And what did he do in that debate is he showed that Trumpian populism can be elevated, that it can be magnanimous, that it can be sophisticated, and it put a different sheen on the whole thing. And I think, some of the most decisive moments, I talk to like normies in my orbit who aren't, hacks like us. And what stood out to them was moments when Vance said, I believe that Vice President Harris wants the best for the country. Or he'd say, I know, Tim, you want the best for the country. And I know you have some good ideas, but I just differ with you, And it's just this kind of softer side, magnanimous, open, even as he could be ferocious, obviously, on the campaign trail or when he was giving stump speeches. So value added in a big way. And I spoke with friends who are GOP operatives, and they're like, well, I mean, it's Vance's party now, no matter what happens. This was before the election. Even if Trump loses, they said it's Vance's party, but now it's just utterly solidified.
Now,
Yeah, I'll just sorry.
No, go ahead, Geoff. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll just add something quickly. I mean, I think another thing that stood out about Vance was his willingness to mix it up in interviews and kind of unscripted appearances in, seemingly hostile spaces. I mean, his interview with the New York Times' Lulu Garcia Navarro was, very good and interesting and strong. So I think, it really highlighted the way that, and I, it highlighted the way that Harris was avoiding that type of situation, and just made it seem, again, just kind of like weirdly hostile to the public. Just that there was an unwillingness to kind of get out there and do this when Vance was doing it like day in and day out. So I think that was quite noteworthy as well, and just his ability as a communicator really stood out. So I think that was significant, and particularly in contrast to what we were seeing from the other side, in terms of this like weird avoidance of the media, which I think again fits into this kind of weird like hostility to the public or discomfort with just kind of mixing it up in open-ended environments where you're not sure what you're going to get. This kind of fixation on control and choreography. So I think he showed this willingness to kind of get out there and not preach to the choir, which again highlighted the opposite on the other side.
And I want to just talk for a second about the Walls pick, which is interesting to me. As some of our listeners may know, I'm really from the same part of Nebraska as Walls. His mother and my grandmother grew up together in Boyd County, where he graduated from high school. A long declining and very rural part of the country, and I think the Walls pick signaled some of the better instincts of the Harris campaign, and also why those instincts really failed to benefit it in any concrete way. The Harris campaign seemed to understand that it and its party have a problem with male voters, with rural voters, and you could maybe say centrally white male rural voters, the notorious subjects of the white rural rage scare that was ginned up a while ago. And so, picking this man who's a hunter, who's genuinely from rural America. He's not a fake rural American, whatever. He's a real one. However phony you find his affect, that is where he's from. He wore this kind of Elmer Fudd, plaid coat, and drove his IH Scout, pickup truck, basically a car made by a tractor company. To give you an idea, that's very celebrated among some farming families, including my own. Uh, and it just didn't work because the the pick was a sort of symbolic concession to these people, but it wasn't a substantive accommodation of them. It wasn't. It failed to. The Harris campaign was willing to pick a white rural guy, but he's one who was very very liberal, has uh, turned Minnesota into this kind of abortion sanctuary state, enacted a law that removed obligations to provide medical care to children born alive during an abortion procedure. Very, very into the trans world, as Trump once amusingly said. Uh, but to put it more precisely, just very supportive of the most extreme demands of the LGBT activist uh, apparatus, and it would have been more effective, I think, for the Harris campaign to just pick a kind of urban uh, or East Coast uh, member of a minority group, but actually reject progressive priorities in some high profile and somewhat costly way that showed we have a willingness and an ability to break with the most unpopular elements of our agenda, whether that be on the borders, where yes, Harris did shift, but the shifts were incremental, and finally they lacked credibility because she refused to do them in a costly way, in a public way that really committed her to a radically different position, to move against some of the elements of the LGBT movement, to just say, I reject urban disorder. Yes, I am voting for the California ballot measure that will lead to better policing. Her inability, her refusal to do this, I think would have been more reassuring to these rural voters than the strange kind of tokenism that we got with Tim Walz. I mean, this is a part of the country, as I've said many times, where Barack Obama uh, performed considerably better than Joe Biden. And people are not saying, "Oh, well, just put up Scranton Joe, put up a white guy, and then I'm going to feel very reassured, and I will vote for him, and I will support your party." That's really not what it's about. You have to, you know, make some kind of real accommodation of them, and that's going to require probably rejecting some priorities of your coalition and wounding the pride of some other members of it. And that's just something Harris wasn't willing to do. And uh, that's why the Walls phenomenon, I think failed. I watched Kamala's concession speech yesterday, and many of the supporters were wearing the kind of camo hats with blaze orange lettering. That again was a sort of symbolic concession to the sort of uh, you know duck hunter aesthetics that they wanted to evoke. But you can't just put on a camo hat and then think rural people are going to support you.
Yeah, I mean, one final remark on the VPs would be, clearly and this I think speaks to what I'm, trying to articulate about the party as a whole. That another point about Walz was that he was chosen in part as a kind of reliable sort of attack dog and loyalist who would serve the campaign, but not as somebody who would really. I mean, there's maybe some vague sense in which he might point to a possible future of the party where it could kind of reclaim some of this, Midwestern populist energy, but he didn't really offer that in a particularly substantial way in the end, and that became evident pretty quickly. And so it, I think, also speaks to, if you compare it to the Vance pick, which represents a kind of ambition and a success, like it's an appointment of a successor who is somehow going to embody the future of the party. And it seems that over several cycles, Democratic standard bearers have picked vice presidents who would in some way not represent some kind of competition or challenge to them. And so there's this kind of safetyism around like picking somebody who's clearly subordinate rather than representing some kind of rival faction within the party, which is often historically what has happened. Where you have like JFK picking LBJ, who's a hugely powerful sort of power broker. Just as one clear example of a very different kind of logic. And then you have like this instead picking these people who are not going to overshadow the main act, which is what Biden was for Obama, clearly. And I think Harris was for Biden in a stranger, more convoluted way, perhaps. Like it was in a way that her quite weak performance in the primary, extremely weak performance in the primary, might have given her a leg up for the VP pick within this logic of somebody who's not going to be, who's not going to challenge the primacy of the president or the nominee. So there's something weirdly kind of unambitious about that logic that you see again and again, and I think you saw it here too.
Personality wise, I never could muster the hatred many had for Walz. I thought I could do a pretty good impression of his hand movements. At least Matthew will tell you. I mean, obviously this is silly because we're on a podcast and you can't see me. I'm sounding like Ross Perot here, where he was on NPR and he'd say like, "Now look at his chart here," even though it was radio. But anyway, I thought he was endearing and ineffective. you know.
Yeah, endearing. It's not, his affect was much commented upon, and I realized what I thought about it when I saw him go to the Michigan Minnesota game, and he was posing with or interacting with in some humorous way uh, the mascots at the game, and I realized that his exaggerated hand gestures uh, and facial expressions reminded me a bit of a mascot, of a man who is before a crowd and trying to rally a certain kind of enthusiasm, but who doesn't and it isn't overly concerned with uh, expressing a kind of dignity or self-respect. And that's how I would describe the way Walz came across, at least to me, and maybe to a few other voters. And that's a little interesting because he was presented to voters as and partly selected on the basis of his ability to seem like a paragon of a certain sort of American, rurally embedded manhood. So uh, he will return to Minnesota, and as Kamala said yesterday, he will have a political career that goes extends beyond this moment. And he's still a pretty young man, so we may see him again in 4 years. But with that, Jeff has already left the chat. He's off to more important things, working hard as always. And we will catch you next week. We'll have a lot to say on the podcast and on our site about the shape the Trump administration is going to take. Uh, it will be a time of controversy and of some change. And we'll be covering it all at compactmag.com.